Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mia Burke, and I am Program Manager with Hanford Challenge. Hanford Challenge is a nonprofit based in Seattle that focuses on cleanup of the Hanford nuclear site and supports insiders, workers, and whistleblowers who have issues that are not being addressed. This is the 15th webinar of our Nuclear Waste Scholar Series. We started the series to inspire action and involvement with Hanford Cleanup. Over the course of the series, we've invited movers, shakers, and thinkers to share groundbreaking scholarship, art, research, and experience working with nuclear waste. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers, Shampa Biswas and Anne Harrington. Shampa is Judge and Mrs. Timothy A. Paul Chair of Political Science at Whitman College. She is a post-colonial international relations theorist whose work examines the inequalities of the nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament regime. She's the author of Nuclear Desire, Power, and the Post-Colonial Nuclear Order. Shampa is currently working on a project about nuclear memorialization and the global story of Fat Man. Anne Harrington is an associate professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Cardiff University in Wales. Anne earned her PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. She has held fellowships at major universities in the US and Europe. Her most recent publication is a co-edited volume called Behavioral Economics and Nuclear Weapons. Shampa and Anne are recent recipients of a Plowshares grant focused on decolonizing the nuclear studies curriculum, which will be the focus of their talk today. So Shampa and Anne will give the presentation, and then following the presentation, we will have time for Q&A. If you can't stick around for the whole time, feel free to leave. We will be recording the presentation and we'll share a link of the recording with everyone that registered. Thank you so much for joining us today, Shampa and Anne. I will pass it to you now to talk about your work.
Thank you, Mia. Thanks for inviting both of us to do this. So we are going to talk about the project that Mia already mentioned, which is really a collaboration with a whole slew of other academics. So Anne and I were the lead on this, but there were others who worked with us on it. And we did this work with the help of a grant from the Plowshares Fund. We call it Decolonizing Nuclear Studies, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means, why we took that project on at this time. We had wanted to do this as an interactive session. We thought we would sort of teach the teaching resources we have created, but it turns out we are not going to be able to do that here. It doesn't really work well in a webinar setting. It works better in a Zoom setting. We would have wanted you to do some homework if you did an interactive session, and our website is still not completely up and running. So Mia has actually kindly invited us to come back if there is any interest in an interactive session in the future. So please do let her know if you would like us to come back to do that. So today what we're going to talk about is the project of decolonization itself, in particular decolonizing nuclear studies. We'll talk a little bit about the platform where this project is going to live, which is called Highly Enriched. We'll give you some visual previews of what we have created. And then if you have a little time, we'll run you through some of the exercises and assignments that we have created, a very small sample. So I'm going to share my screen here. So I want to begin by thinking a little bit about why decolonizing nuclear studies, what does it mean? First thing to say here is that academia is a slow-moving beast. Nothing happens quickly in academia. Changes in curriculum, changes in ways of teaching and pedagogy, it seems like sometimes takes forever. In part, that is because getting a PhD, which is what qualifies you to teach, takes a lot of time and a lot of investment of resources, and training in a discipline and investment in the norms of that discipline. And the way that academia works is the incentive structure actually does not reward you for stepping outside the bounds of that discipline, outside of what that discipline decides are the most important questions, how you approach those questions. There's not a lot of incentive for stepping outside of those. Also, changing curriculum requires generally agreement among a large group of academics in a department, and academics, I think, by nature, are not very agreeable people often. So it takes a while for change to happen. Sometimes that change happens because of pressure from the outside. And I'm going to talk about different kinds of pressure that have really moved academia towards inclusion of questions of race and gender and colonialism. So a whole series of changes happened in the 1960s and 70s, in part because of other things that were happening at the time, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, which also then helped generate a whole host of student protests on campus. And that was a period when students were really demanding more attention to questions of race, to questions of gender. What that did do is that it started a whole series of new programs of study. So centers of race and ethnicity, centers to study race and ethnicity, feminist theory programs, gender studies programs. These were all sort of products of that kind of pressure that came from the outside. And a lot of really significant work happened at those centers, in those programs. They yielded new ways of looking at the world, new tools of analysis. They helped us understand structural racism, which we now sort of talk about a lot. They helped us understand why patriarchy continues to reproduce itself despite all the advances in women's rights. So there's a lot of sort of significant work that happened, but one result of the fact that these came up as separate programs of study was that traditional departments kind of remained insulated from those changes. They went about their business in the same usual ways. And then I'm talking about, there were changes in some disciplines, but disciplines like history, political science, where I was trained, philosophy, English, remains kind of insulated from those changes. That has started to change in the last couple of decades because of new outside pressures. And I'm going to name a few. So I would say the protests that started in the late 1990s to the 2000s, the anti-globalization protests played a big part in this. There were a lot of people who were arguing that globalization was creating new forms of imperialism around the world, creating a new class of poor, both within the global north and the global south. There were also movements around campus on thinking about the colonial architecture and colonial constitution of the academy. That slavery and colonialism had provided the kinds of resources that made modern institutions of the academy possible. And you could see that in sort of monuments, the names of buildings. And there was a movement to take many of those down. It started with what was called Rhodes Must Fall in South Africa and the UK, but also in the US. And then, of course, the Black Lives movement, the Black Lives Matter movement that began after the George Floyd murder in 2020, but really became global. A real push to take anti-racism and anti-Blackness seriously. And so that, in addition to inside pressures from traditional disciplines, so there were now more and more people within traditional disciplines who had been exposed to some of the work that had come out of race and ethnic studies, work that had come out of gender studies programs, who were also putting pressure on traditional disciplines. And that is what really led to this demand to decolonize the academy. There are a lot of departments, there's a lot of disciplines that have really taken this up as a problematic, that are thinking about this, that are really questioning the ways their disciplines have been created on assumptions about Black and brown people around the world, about what problems matter. history, political science to some extent, anthropology, even comparative literature departments, philosophy. They're all asking these questions. But it appeared to us that nuclear studies, especially nuclear studies within security studies, was fairly conventional still, was kind of recalcitrant to these changes that were happening elsewhere. It's not as though they were not scholars who had not thought about the relationship of colonialism and nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament. But they were largely in fields that have remained peripheral to what we would call sort of conventional nuclear studies. They happen in fields like anthropology, cultural studies, science and technology studies, but not in the security studies fields which generated most policymakers, or generated experts who had the ears of policymakers. Those seem to us to remain largely conventional. And I'm going to do a caricatured version of a conventional syllabus. This is what led us to sort of think about decolonizing nuclear studies. So conventional nuclear studies syllabus may start with the Manhattan Project and the making of the bomb, and then spend a lot of time on deterrence theory, on managing the bomb, kind of forgetting in the process that in the early years of the making of the bomb, there was a lot of questioning about whether states could manage the bomb, right? Whether nuclear technology, nuclear materials should be under international control, including by scientists in the Manhattan Project. A lot of time in these syllabi on deterrence theory, understanding ways that nuclear weapons can be managed, then some time on proliferation as a problem, right? And proliferation as the spread of nuclear weapons to states that are not the existing nuclear weapon states. Once you've thought about nuclear weapon states as responsible custodians of nuclear weapons, being able to manage nuclear weapons, then proliferation becomes the big problem, usually ending with Iran and North Korea as the problems to watch out for. And what this does is then it sort of helps you forget. By the time you finish the syllabus, you've forgotten that the US still has 3,000 plus nuclear weapons, right? Active nuclear weapons. You forget that the US is the only country in the world that has used 2 nuclear weapons. You forget that the production of nuclear weapons, such as at sites like Hanford, have also generated a lot of harm and continue to generate a lot of harm. You forget the history of testing, nuclear testing, which has happened primarily on the lands and bodies of brown and Black people around the world, right? So the case we made to Plowshares was, for disarmament to become a real possibility, we really need to change the way young people, tomorrow's policymakers, are educated, right? They need to think differently about nuclear weapons. And it was our sense from the networks that we are involved in that younger scholars are actually interested in doing this work, but it's really hard to do this if you've been trained in the conventional field. It's really hard to figure out where to begin, very hard to conceptualize new ways of teaching. So we took upon ourselves to create teaching resources to help decolonize the nuclear studies syllabus, which is to really integrate the thinking about race and colonialism, environmentalism, and feminism, integrate rather than just add on at the end of a syllabus, because that sometimes did happen, right? Really integrate them into the structure of the syllabus to help push back against the normalization of nuclear weapons. Perhaps you might still end by thinking that deterrence is the only way to go, but not without actually having grappled with the dangers of nuclear weapons and the dangers of nuclear weapons through its entire fuel cycle, not just as finished weapons, right? So our hope was to really sort of develop these, help people develop curricula that can denormalize nuclear weapons, that can help you think about nuclear weapons through these different lenses that have not been covered. So I'll stop there, and I'll hand over the microphone to Anne to talk about where these resources will live, and then we'll talk about the resources themselves.
Great. Thank you, Shampa. That was an excellent exposition of the history of decolonizing in the academy, and also the kind of origins of this project. So the place where Shampa and I kind of come together in this is that I am one of the co-founders of a website called Highly Enriched. Highly Enriched exists to try to broaden the reach of teaching resources, to include mentoring, informational interviews, guest speakers in classroom settings, and also, support things like this kind of speaker series that Hanford Challenge puts on. And then educational resources like the ones that we've created for the Decolonizing Nuclear Studies project. It has a mission that is really about diversifying the field by having both larger types of viewpoints represented, but also people from different backgrounds represented as well. This little video is something that plays on our homepage that represents these different aspects of the Highly Enriched project. This is a publicly available website. Anybody's welcome to go onto it and create an account. And there is a mentor portal where people can contact. It's right now, I would say the mentor portal mostly consists of either academics or policy people who are in the DC area. Mentor portal, the library with educational resources, and it's supposed to create a kind of synergistic space, right? This is where I both find things to teach in my classroom, but also send my students to if they're interested. Every year, I have a couple of students who are interested in going on in the field. So this might be a place that I send them to say, go do an informational interview with somebody who has a job you think you want, find out how they got it. So the Decolonizing Nuclear Studies project will both be, most of the things that are on Highly Enriched are just kind of aggregated. We do interviews with mentors, so you can also just watch someone talk about their career if you don't want to contact them. But so we do a lot of original interviews, but a lot of the content is aggregated from things that already exist. The notion is that there wasn't, everyone teaches their own version of the Non-Proliferation Treaty simulation, and let's collect those and share them with one another, make them something that's available right now. If I'm looking for something like that, I could reach out on Facebook to my network and I could ask somebody to send me one of those, but there's not a really great place to go look for something like that that is actually designed for classroom use. And so this aggregates, I think we have 2 versions of the non-proliferation simulation up there from 2 different scholars at the moment. So Decolonizing Nuclear Studies is a project of Highly Enriched in the sense that Highly Enriched came with the relationships with the web designers and the graphic designer and the experience with building a website. And we partnered with Shampa and found new funding in order to not just do aggregation, but actually start to try to shape the field by creating resources that build on this mission of supporting diversity within this space. And so we partnered with Shampa to create what are 3 modules that could be taught together as one class over the course of a semester, or they could be things that each module consists of multiple resources and activities. And those things both will be something that you can enter into on the website and have its own pages, but they also exist as things that are independently uploaded to the educational resource library. And they can be downloaded. Everything's freely downloadable from this library of resources. So it's sort of like a, it can be mix and match, or it can be something that's much more directed. So we wanted to make it something that is available for people to incorporate into their syllabi in whatever way works best for them. I think at this point, I might actually hand things back to Shampa, because this is a good place to talk more specifically about what the modules consist of, what their themes are, and we have a little, I think we have a little promo videos showing you what the web pages will look like.
Okay, so this will be our landing page. It's the Decolonizing Nuclear Studies. And as Anne already said, we are thinking about this. We divided up the work of building this project into 3 modules, each of which come at this question from different places. So the first is feminism and the nuclear world. The second is race, colonialism, and nuclear weapons. And the third is what the module builders call the more than human world, an atlas for navigating the nuclear environment, which is environmental approaches to nuclear weapons. Just keeping in mind that all 3 of them do all of these things, right? So you cannot really talk about race without also talking about gender. The folks who build the resources on gender also were thinking actively about race. So we really sort of embrace the principle of intersectionality, that all these issues cross-connect and work together. Each of the modules, Anne already said this, contain a whole range of teaching resources. So they have lecture notes, they have different kinds of assignments that you could administer in a class, they have exercises, homework assignments, they have videos that you can use with some questions for what to do with those videos. So there's a bunch of different resources in each of those. One of the challenges that we took on and we gave all the teams that were building the modules was to visualize a style that best represented what they wanted to convey. Since this was going to live on the web, and because our students are increasingly visual thinkers, we wanted people to really sort of convey with the materials and the look of the materials and the design of the materials, the affect that they expected the materials to produce in their students. So this is keeping in mind that students learn not just through the cognitive register, it's not just through content, but also through different kind of affective registers. So we wanted our team builders to really think about the ways that you want the students to feel, be moved by the materials that they were creating. And this is represented in the very different visual styles of the 3 modules. And I'm going to play quick video previews of each of the modules. And I want that to keep in mind, and then I'll talk a little bit about each of them. Okay, so the first one is the feminism one. Okay, so the visual field that are, so as you saw, this module centers itself around 3 nodes. And the visual field that they wanted to really use was the cursor that becomes a torch. You can see it as I move it. And the idea was that a feminist lens draws attention to different kinds of things. It illuminates different things in the world. So the three specific topics that they wanted students to explore was bodies, thinking about how bodies are impacted by nuclear weapons production and use. What does it mean to be an irradiated body? How radiation has affected different kinds of bodies differently over time. There's a lot of exercises related to that. Homes and families, thinking about the use of homes in some of the early nuclear testing exercises in the 1950s, the ways that mothers have positioned themselves or taken up that particular identity in order to push for nuclear disarmament. Experts, and this really tries to draw attention to who counts as an expert in the nuclear field. And they have various exercises that make you think about the image of an expert that pops into your head when you think about expertise, and then draw attention to all kinds of expertise that exist in, for instance, impacted communities and activists and advocates that have been working around those areas. So to sort of reorient our understanding of what it means to be an expert. Okay, I'm going to play the video. I should maybe close these. This is from the environmentalism module. Okay. So you probably got a sense of this, the visual feel that they really wanted to center waterways, keeping in mind how much of nuclear testing happened on island areas and over oceans, right? So this is what you see in the background. They created these four nodes through which to understand the more than human world, the impact of nuclear weapons production and use on not just humans, but on nature, on animals, on plants, on our waterways. So the first is circuitry, which looks at the circulation of nuclear knowledges, nuclear materials, nuclear technology around the world. Contamination, that looks at the ways that various nuclear sites have been contaminated in the nuclear fuel cycle, sites like Hanford. Conservation, that looks at all the ways that these nuclear sites are being turned into nature preserves, right, as a way to mask the contamination. And then contestation as a way to remind us that there has always been a long history of contesting against normalizing these ways of contaminating our environments, and the different sort of cosmologies available to think about the human relationship to nature. Okay, and then I'm going to play the last module sneak peek. So this is the module that looks more closely at race, colonialism, and nuclear weapons. And they do this at the global level. Like you probably noticed that the other modules all deal with questions of race and the fact that race is very much at play in the ways that different communities have been impacted. The visual field that this group chose it's called the parallax design. And as I scroll down, you'll notice that the foreground will move a little faster than the background. And the idea is here that there has been this core nuclear knowledge produced by the powerful nuclear weapon states, but alongside that, in parallel, there have been knowledges that have been generated from the peripheries that have drawn connections to race, colonialism, and nuclear weapons. So what does it mean to decenter what has been the taken for granted, which still remains in the background? There are 3 case studies in this module. The first case study is on Bandung, the Bandung Conference, which was a 1955 conference in which leaders from African and Asian countries met. And actually, they had a position on nuclear weapons, and they argued that nuclear weapons were a way for powerful countries in the post-colonial world to continue to remain powerful, to maintain their power, right? So there was a powerful connection made between nuclear weapons, race, and colonialism. So that's the first case study. The second case study is on Pakistan's nuclear weapons program. And the third case study is a comparative analysis of Iran versus Israel's nuclear weapons program. And really the question of why one gets a disproportionate amount of attention while the other does not. So that's all I have. I'm going to hand this over to Anne, who will walk us through a couple of exercises.
Thank you. I'm gonna share my screen. So we've, these modules were all created by teams of academics from universities, I think almost exclusively in the US and Europe. Even though individuals have varied backgrounds, but most of their education was in Western contexts. So all of the knowledge that's being presented here is something that has been, that is drawing on their core areas of expertise, and oftentimes also draws on activities that they might typically teach and do in their classroom with their students. So there's 40 plus assets in total that include different informational resources and activities. And we just, in the interest of time, we've only chosen a couple to kind of give you a sample of what kinds of activities are there. Most of the activities themselves are made in the form of PDFs that have active links on them. So they're made to be distributed easily, either directly from the highly enriched website or through online courseware distribution, right? So they're PDFs, but they're not meant to be printed out. They're meant to be consumed online. So this is from, this activity is from the Feminism in the Nuclear World module. They have the 3 streams that Shampa described already. And one of those streams is thinking about expertise and what constitutes expertise, which has been something that is a recurrent theme in feminist discourse around nuclear issues. Is how do you achieve expert standing? How do you show yourself as an expert? And so it asks you through the activities in that stream, it asks students to engage critically with the idea of what constitutes expertise. So I'm just going to read some of this text to you. In the previous 2 tasks in this section ask you to think about what a nuclear expert looks like, sounds like, and knows. So one of the previous tasks, for instance, students listen to sound clips of what an expert sounds like, and then they are asked to talk about that critically. The purpose of this task is to engage with questions of whose expertise gets heard and why. What types of power are associated with the different types of expertise, and what are the implications of these differences in power? Below are links to 3 sources of information on the nuclear testing that states conducted over several decades across the Pacific. The task is to read and watch these different forms of expertise and answer the associated questions. So the PDFs all have a similar format in this module, in the feminism module, where they link to readings that are the core assigned readings that are meant to be done ahead of time, the students. And then those things are supplemented by other types of online content. So one of the ideas here is to really try to utilize and bring into the classroom not just article-based, but also things that include various kinds of visual and auditory, use all of the senses in the students' learning experiences. So this one is looking specifically at the French nuclear tests in the Pacific. So after, I think that, did it not show it didn't show what it linked to, did it? In the screen sharing? No. Okay. I'm going to reshare just so that y'all can see what that looks like. So I opened the link that was in the PDF, and it links to a website on the Morora files on the French nuclear tests in the Pacific. So, and then it has a list of discussion questions about this text. And as an instructor, we often, I feel like, don't put as much time and thought or coming up with discussion questions. It's labor of itself. All right. It's something that once you do it many, many times as a professor, it starts to come as second nature, especially when you teach the same thing over and over again. But one of the ways that we're trying to support the dissemination of these learning resources is by giving tools to people who this might not be in the center of what they normally teach, in the center of their expertise. And so by providing them with these kinds of prompts that are specific to classroom use, you're making it easier for them to pick this up and teach it. You're making the kind of like workload burden on them, which is always a problem within the academy. How much time do you have to prep for teaching and so forth? You're lightening that load, right? So there's discussion questions that go with that. Again, another link to an external source with discussion questions on it. And at the end, for lots of times there are written assignments associated with different kinds of prompts and assessments for assessing learning for the students. And so we always include a list of the resources that all of the information in these lessons is being drawn from. In addition, also, if you want to continue to explore this, further suggested readings. So that would be an example of something from the feminism module. And now I'm going to switch over and we'll look at the more than human module for a minute. So you can see that there's a lot of crossover in themes. The feminism theme talks about expertise, but they're talking about French nuclear testing and the environmental and human impacts of that in the context of it. But it's sort of centered through this idea of how the tradition of feminist theory is conceptualizing these things. The approach of the more than human group is also a feminist approach, but instead of centering gender, it's centering environmental concerns. It's centering things from the perspective of what they're calling more than human, meaning how do we see beyond the human in order to understand how the environment also constitutes an actor. So they have a module roadmap, and they have, you can teach this in an ordered fashion that runs through their 4 different themes. So I just randomly picked something from one of the activities from this to show and share with you. This one is on contamination. And they all have learning objectives that they specify, which is helpful for an instructor. A student as well, actually, but it's, useful to know what it is that the objective is teaching. So this one is select one of the sites featured on the More Than Human module: Chernobyl, Rocky Mountain Flats, Marshall Islands, French Polynesia. In 3 or more paragraphs, summarize the nuclear activities that took place at the site, describe the impacts on the more than human world. So this is more of a writing reflection activity that has follow-on, questions about this. A second activity, nuclear colonialism as a discursive formation, and it gives, again, some different suggested readings, and then asks the students to interact critically with what those readings are saying. So this gives you an idea of the types of activities. This one is, third activity is focused more on the idea that part of how we've interpreted decolonizing nuclear studies as a pedagogical tool is really to try to move beyond the idea of things being cognitive and conceptual as being a privileged form of knowledge, to also include other types of knowledge as being central to learning activities: sight, sound, smell, touch. So this final activity draws in those aspects of this learning experience. So I think I'm going to pass it back to you now, Shampa.
I think that's all we had for our presentation, and we'd be happy to answer questions. I think we have a little bit of time here.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing these vital resources for educators. I love just hearing about it and seeing all the readings that are out there, and how the modules work. I think we're going to open it up to questions now. So please put your questions in the chat or use the Q&A feature, and we can, I'll read them off and we'll answer those. And I think we can start. I know, Anne, you answered it a little in the chat, but can you talk about the non-proliferation treaty simulation in a little more detail?
Yeah, absolutely. So I co-teach a class, and when Shampa it's called International Politics in the Nuclear Age, and I co-teach it with a realist scholar at my university. And I was kind of chuckling when Shampa was talking about what a typical class would look like, because that is exactly what our class looks like. The scholar I teach with happens to be a historian. So he very much is all about starting with the Manhattan Project, and we move through in exactly the way that Shampa talks about. Although when I get to questions of proliferation, one of the things that I spend more time on is the test ban treaty, and the questions of fallout from testing. And I try to take the proliferation question and expand the lens that I teach that through. But I was kind of chuckling about that because one of the things that we do is when we get to the proliferation section, we run a simulation of the non-proliferation treaty, which is a role-playing exercise where you split the students into country groups, and they have prep time as a country. You give them position papers, and they show up, and all the countries get up and they give their statements publicly, just like it would happen in a treaty conference. And then everyone votes and a document gets produced. Sometimes it matches history and sometimes it doesn't. But what the simulation does is it sets up the choices, and it gives the country position and sets up the choices. And the simulation is weighted so that you would expect to get a historically accurate outcome, which sometimes happens and sometimes doesn't. The students are then assessed on the basis of writing a report on what happened home to their head of state. And this is the kind of learning experience where it gets students to go much more in depth into one country's position, but also learn the larger concepts. It's a very common teaching tool. People not only do the Non-Proliferation Treaty, there are now TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition on Nuclear Weapons. There are simulations for that treaty as well. But it's something that when I was learning about these things initially, I had this experience, and it's an experience that I like to give my students. I'm sorry, my watch keeps going off. So I think, did people have more questions about that at all? But there's a couple, there's one from Scott Sagan at Stanford and one from Alex Wellerstein at Stevens Institute of Technology up on the website.
That's a fantastic exercise. I'm sure students love it. It sounds really fun. Our next question is, how is your pedagogy problematizing borders and the Westphalian nation-state system?
Yeah, so I think in all kinds of ways. I mean, you cannot ignore the Westphalian nation-state system, because that is the system through which the nuclear weapons world order gets reproduced, right? So it's nation states that are the actors in the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty that Anne just talked about. So you can't just pretend like they don't exist, right? So there are that is absolutely one of the lenses through which you can understand the nuclear world, the decisions that states make to pursue nuclear weapons, to maintain nuclear weapons, to decide to sign the TPNW and not create nuclear weapons, right? But the nuclear world is most certainly, the impacts of the nuclear world is much are felt at scales much smaller and much larger than the nation state, right? They're felt at the cellular level in bodies that are irradiated, much smaller than the nation state, but also much larger in the environmental impacts that they have. And all three modules consider the larger than human or the larger than nation state effects of nuclear weapons production and use. So I would say we both work with the nation state system, but also work against it, work in excess of it. So it's with and against. We don't sort of pretend like the nation state system does not exist. But we also don't take that as the only lens through which to understand what's going on in the nuclear world.
Can I add one point of clarification? So those non-proliferation treaty simulations are a much more traditional teaching tool, and they are in the resource library on the highly enriched platform, but those aren't part of the Decolonizing Nuclear Studies project. Specifically within that project, with these modules we've been sharing with you, we had a lot of pedagogical discussions early on about where to start, and we specifically chose not to start sort of in that place that you would start. So instead, we're starting basically with kind of much more local, either specific in terms of bodies, specific in terms of places, specific in terms of events, right? But we sort of tried to start in a different place that it's not that the state system isn't there, but it's challenging it in the sense that it's not centering it within that curricula.
Great, thank you. Do you have material in your modules on Fukushima?
So I think there's a lot of questions about, do we have materials on specific locations or in specific areas? And I'm going to say yes and no to those. Well, firstly, this is a start, right? We are hoping that we are going to be able to continue building on this. We created 40 plus assets, but it still feels like we just scratched the surface. There are so many sites around the world that we did not have time or the expertise to include in the different modules. So there is reference to Fukushima, but we don't have a full-fledged case study on Fukushima. And we would love to have a full-fledged case study on Fukushima by somebody who has the expertise to build that, right? So it means recruiting new experts, new people who can work on some of that. We have references to New Mexico, but we don't have a full-fledged case study of New Mexico, nor of Hanford. Actually, that is another case study I or somebody else, I hope will build. And I think that's a state. So somebody raised a question about the military-industrial complex and attention to questions of class. And I think that is a phenomenal question. And it is a consideration that runs through all three modules, but not fully taken on as a problematic, I think. So the module on feminism is thinking very much about who is made vulnerable by nuclear weapons production and use. And that is absolutely determined by social class, right? Poorer people tend to be more affected by nuclear impacts and have fewer resources to protect themselves in situations where there's contamination or nuclear testing, right? So I think a class is very much in consideration, is one vector of analysis in all three modules, but is not fully fleshed out. And I think I would love to see something more on the military-industrial complex, on the nuclear lobby, on the disproportionate effects of disproportionate amount of resources that go into nuclear weapons production and modernization, right? And what that means in terms of opportunity costs, what that means in terms of resources lost towards remediation of other social issues. So I'll say we've taken on a big project, but have, I would say, just got to a fraction of what we could have. So these are all great ideas, and we would love to do more. And also, we would love to invite more people to contribute, to continue help us build this further.
Yeah, can I add to what Shampa was saying? I just want to say a little bit about the process, which is when we started this project, we didn't know what anything would look like. So we approached it through a design thinking process that was iterative. And we asked groups of academics, there's 3 to 5 academics in each group, to come together as a group and talk about what they might create. And getting, this was something that was new to everyone involved, this idea of communicating visually, creating a visual space, and then populating that with information. And so the groups did wildly different things, right? The activities that the feminism group has are much more experientially oriented as opposed to the activities in the More Than Human group. But the other thing was that the expertise that is reflected is very much based on who volunteered for the project, right? Who showed up to offer their expertise. But we did try to build these modules in such a way that whatever form they took, there was always the possibility to add another site, add another activity. And one of the beautiful things about having something live online as opposed to in print is that you always have the opportunity to go back and do another version of it. So we very much hope, especially I think with the More Than Human one, if you agree, Shampa, I think we hope to have more sites, right? To do that same sort of intellectual work, which, Shampa has already indicated, just, a matter of time and money. So, but we love the suggestions of the places that you're interested in. That's really helpful to hear what there's a demand for.
I want to confirm that this is an ongoing open source platform open to various educators working on curriculum, that it's free. Is that correct? Okay.
Yes, it's all foundation funded at the moment. So it's nonprofit and everything is freely available.
Fantastic. Does your curriculum address the intersection between nuclear power and nuclear energy, especially with the climate crisis, via the climate crisis and the energy transition to the current era?
I'm going to say, so the more than human module, for instance, doesn't really thinks of the nuclear fuel cycle, right? Is not sort of separating the production of weapons from the production of nuclear power. It's really focusing on the ways nuclear production itself has impacted communities where different sites of nuclear production have happened, whether that's nuclear power plants or whether that's weapons production plants or whether that's weapons testing. So in a sense, I think they consider both the production of nuclear energy and nuclear weapons as a problem in that sense, in the ways that it has contaminated landscapes and human lives. And
I'm trying to see if there's anything that we haven't answered yet.
We haven't talked about the reifying. I think Eileen O'Shaughnessy has a really nice question about whether or not our choice of title reifies the field. And I would say yes, and yes, and the one of the things that has happened is there is work out there in other disciplines that addresses so many of the questions, and the problematic is that we started with, in some ways, that I think Shampa really nicely described in her opening comments, is how to create this bridge back into more of a security studies context. And part of that we tried to do through branding, not just doing it through the content itself, but also literally we also chose a logo that recalls the kind of authority that you might see in a think tank context. Like we tried to communicate kind of both visually and through the knowledge base that this is something to be taken seriously. And so accepting a certain amount of the way that things have been reified in some ways is, I mean, maybe it'll work and maybe it won't in terms of how much this gets taken up and taught within more traditional political science classes on these issues. But trying to place things in ways that they might be taken up, part of that is by using categories that people are already familiar with. But I think, absolutely, yes, you are absolutely right to point out that that's what's happening.
Yeah, so I just read that question. It is such a great question, but it seems to me that this is a question we struggle with anytime we think about sort of changing, reforming a field that we find problematic, right? So I think back to early feminist discussions about whether women should join the military, or if we want, do we want to sort of transform that institution, or do we want more women, more minorities to join what is a misogynist, racist institution, right? It's that same question. I mean, here is a field that's deeply problematic. Do we just make it more palatable by like diversifying it and making it look better? And I think it's always the with and against. You have to do both simultaneously, right? The field of nuclear studies is not going away. They are still producing experts, and they still have the ears of the experts that come out of those programs are the ears of nuclear policymakers. So we do want those who are going to become future nuclear policymakers, future experts, to think differently, to have a more expanded understanding of what nuclear weapons production and use does, right? To not think about weapons in just an abstracted way. So we want to do that, but we also want to keep pushing against the field. So I think, yes, we reify it, but I think in also sort of pushing from the inside, you're also sort of loosening the boundaries of what the field is, I hope.